theory geek. With this first episode of Reading Up to Spivak, I'll begin my discussion on Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak's most daunting text, Can the Subaltern Speak? Over the past few weeks, I was discussing this essay with a friend, and I realized more or less two things about the text. First is that the lecturers who teach this text are extremely well qualified to do so in the majority of cases, but the students who study it, especially at the undergraduate level, are not. And that's not exactly a fault of the student, it's just because this text is so strongly multidisciplinary and draws upon several disciplines that it's not very difficult for the general student of a specific discipline, especially literature, where it is probably the most frequently taught, to grasp. But that also means that any attempt on my part to discuss the matter and content of Spivak's text itself would be pretty much ridiculous and a tad bit insulting to the scores of lecturers who are infinitely more qualified than me. So I decided to work on the background material necessary to comprehensively understand the text, and most importantly the first 5 pages or so, because that's what I was told, and I realized is the most frequently omitted part, because people just don't get a sense of what's going on. I mean, why is she talking about Foucault and Deleuze? Because they never feature again. Why does Marx just kind of come in and out of the text? It's also criticism and a reading of Marx, by the way. So that's how I will be ending, ideally, my series. So I decided to work on the first 5 pages. I will be working with the 1985 version of Can the Subaltern Speak, just to give you an idea. If you have the text in front of you, I think that would do some good, because I will use a couple of paragraphs. I will lift up a couple of paragraphs from the text and discuss it with you. From the next episode, I promise to bring in a scribble pad, so I will have something on the screen where I will write stuff, and that's much easier. For this episode, it's just an introduction and a basic idea about what and how we are going to do things, so I just skip that. So this session is mostly about philosophy and Enlightenment notions, and also I will be discussing notions of hegemony to some extent, because that's one of the first issues that we come across in Spivak's text. I named this series Reading Up to Spivak because I always have this feeling that reading Spivak is kind of an uphill battle, an exercise in exposing the magnitude of my ignorance. But the fun bit here is that is by design. She does not accidentally write difficult stuff, she deliberately writes it in difficult manner, and there's a reason. There is method in madness, which I will also discuss in this episode. Now, before beginning the text, a word or two about Spivak herself. Gayatri Chakraborty, not Spivak at that point, started her academic life in Calcutta, in Presidency College, graduating with honours in English literature in 1959. I was just calculating, she was born in 42, so that means she was 17 when she graduated college. Good for her. But that would also mean that she was in college during the peak of Professor Sushobhan Sarkar's career, although Sushobhan Sarkar himself was at that point teaching at the nascent Jadavpur University between 1956 and 61, but his influence was certainly there at Presidency. Why is that important? Because Sushobhan Sarkar is the main person who essentially brought the philosophy of Antonio Gramsci to India and actually popularized it to some extent among his students. And since hegemony is such a key concept and constitutive element in this entire text, she kind of redefines and reinterprets hegemony in some ways that I think it is very important to set it in perspective. Apparently, she started her master's degree at the University of Calcutta in 1960, but she feuded very publicly, not the first time, and definitely not the last time, with the legendary professor of criticism, Dr. Taraknath Sen, which practically jeopardized her career in Calcutta, forcing her to move to Cornell in the US, and the rest of her story is pretty much well known, so I will not repeat it, but jump directly to the background. Now, in order to understand Can the Subaltern Speak, well, I dare not say understand, but okay, some kind of understanding to be sought from Can the Subaltern Speak, I will look at it in multiple multiple methods or multiple lenses I will be using. The most prominent ones being history and philosophy, because I personally read the text and studied the text in my philosophy class as an extension course to epistemology. So my perspective will be biased in that sense towards history and philosophy, but I think that works because the immediate audience that I anticipate for this podcast are literature students, and they get enough of the literary application and background of the text. Just a heads up, the text itself has been edited and changed a couple of times. I'm using the 1985 version, which is also the first version of Can the Subaltern Speak. There is a 1988 version, which is almost a reprint from the same, and there is a 1999 version which is substantially edited, and there are a couple of paragraphs added and I think one paragraph removed from the text, but I will not be using or dealing with the 1999 text. I will be mostly using the 85 one. So my version is the one that starts at page number 66. I have no idea where the first 65 pages are. I didn't read it, sorry. So it's important to situate it. First, I will do it in the epistemological context and then move on to the historical notion. And then I will be discussing two essential ideas of hegemony and equivocation that needs to be understood before we even go into the text, because in the first two paragraphs or so, we will encounter all that I'm going to discuss in this half an hour or so. And then I will end with the first jargonic word that we encounter, that is subjectivity and subject. And believe me, even to begin to understand the first paragraph, I, at least myself, need all the concepts that I will be discussing in this episode. So epistemology is a big word. It just means the study of knowledge. Episteme means knowledge. Well, technically it means certain kind of knowledge opposed to doxa, but we'll just omit that. Epistemology is a study of knowledge, and knowledge as a corpus or a body. And there are a couple of issues that first need to be understood. The first is, I'll give an illustration. So for example, if I have a box with a coin inside it, and I know how I place the coin, but then I close the box and I vigorously shake the box. The coin changes its position. So if it had heads up, it might become tails or something else, or it might just lean against the wall, so it might be both. But I don't know that. There's no way of knowing the position and the condition of the coin unless and until I open the box. And if there are 10 people in the room, the person who opens the box first knows where the coin is and how the coin is. So the point here is that knowledge, and this is the first premise in epistemology sort of, is that knowledge is always owned. Knowledge does not exist in isolation. That's a myth, that knowledge exists in isolation. Reality exists in isolation. That's debated, but knowledge does not exist in isolation. It is kind of a Schrodinger's cat issue. But if the coin in the box is not seen, is not opened, it's not known whether it is there or whether it is in what condition it is. So knowledge is always owned by somebody. And that establishes a power difference between people and between institutions, who owns knowledge and who does not own knowledge. Because the person who opens the box also gets to decide how the box will be opened. So if I can open it one way, or I can open it the other way. The coin also changes because if I flip over the box, these are bad illustrations, but just bear with me. So knowledge is always owned by somebody. Now the point of schism, one of the points of schism between the continental school of philosophy, which Spivak is mostly subscribing to, which is the French Franco-German school of philosophy, and the Anglo-Saxon or the Anglo-American school of philosophy, is that the Anglo-American school posits that the universe exists as material reality, irrespective of whether somebody is there to know or to observe it. But the continental school posits that the universe does not exist unless there is somebody to observe it. There's somebody, because knowledge is always own, so the knowledge of the universe is impossible. So I don't know if the universe exists or not unless there's somebody. So unless there's humans or another sentient being that observes the universe probably doesn't exist, or is as good as not existing. And the second point here is that the knower and the known, so the knower is the agent that does the knowing, and the known is the element that is known. So the coin, the position and the condition of the coin is the known element, and the person who opened the box, for example, is the knower. The knower and the known are always distinctly different. So they have to be distinctly different. They cannot be the same person or the same entity. What follows from this argument is that the knower cannot know himself or herself. So the self is completely beyond the grasp of the knower. The knower can only know things that is outside himself or herself or itself. These believe me, these sound very fantastic and abstract, but these are notions that come into play right at the beginning in the first paragraph when she discusses subjectivity, which will be the last topic of this episode. How is all that relevant? Because if you look at the text, she begins with the loud assertion. Some of the most radical criticism coming out of the West today is the result of an interested desire to conserve the subject of the West, or the West as subject. Now, if we replace the words knower and the known with the words subject and object, I think we can draw a direct connection to the essay and the Subaltern speak, because the subject in epistemology is somebody who has agency over the knowledge production and the knowledge creation process. So somebody who decides and defines how knowledge will be produced, and what kind of knowledge will be produced, and how will it be stored and perpetuated. So that's the agent, that's the knower, and that's the subject. But the subject tries to know objectively what's going on. So in its attempt to know objectively things in the external world, the subject reduces the element that is being known. The subject reduces the object to an object status. So the object is of inquiry no longer has agency, because the knowledge paradigm does not allow it to have agency. But the subject is also transformed. So when the subject and the object enter into a knower-known relationship, the fun thing is that both the subject and the object get changed. So when they interact, more about this in the next session. But how is all of that relevant to the text? Is because when I read it as a historical text, I think a little background is necessary. In German or Dutch, I don't know other Germanic languages, but in these two languages specifically, there exist multiple words for the understanding of the notion of history. In English, we just have one, but in Bangla and Sanskrit too, we actually have one. In Sanskrit, we can doubt or we can question whether Smriti and Itihasa have distinct meanings, but I will not go into that. Some scholars do posit that. But in English, we just have history. And why it's important is because the method for doing history, or the method for knowing the past, underwent radical transformation in Europe in the early 19th century through one man called Leopold von Ranke. And Ranke was a German count, lived between 1795 and 1886, so pretty long life of 90 years. And he basically inaugurated a new method for doing history that relied solely on written documentation. So if you want to know the history of the period of Charlemagne, then you rely on a written documentation from his period that you know to be credible and you know to be valid. And you basically write the history of Charlemagne's reign. You do not listen to what people are saying. You do not listen to what's called semi-historical or quasi-scientific accounts. If you look at pre-Rankean historiography, in a very broad sense, in generally. So, for example, if you're Indian, if you look at the Indica, which is or the Travels of Huan Sang, etc., the problem, or even Marco Polo, the Travels of Marco Polo, then the problem is that they are replete with rumors and gossip. There's a lot of gossip and rumor there, but all of that was deemed as unscientific by Leopold von Ranke and his followers, who were basically the Enlightenment people. And in their attempt to write history, wie es eigentlich gewesen, so how it essentially was, drew them to this documented, written version of history. The problem appears when you start exporting that ideology, exporting that kind of history writing to the rest of the world, because that is distinctly Eurocentric, and that is a distinctly European method of doing history. And when you try going into Asia or Africa and ask for the same kind of documents, then you're in for a bit of trouble, because you're looking for a fish in the desert. They don't have the same kind of documents. They have different traditions of knowledge production. They have different traditions of knowledge storing, and they have distinctly and radically different methods of dealing with, say, government, because Ranke was mostly interested in what we now call political history, so government and governmentality. And these people have different notions. So, for example, Africa does not have the same kind of written documents or the same institutions that European historians were looking for. So, for example, the nation state, Africa didn't have it in the exact same definition as the Europeans would. And then they came to India. India had somewhat similar stuff, but it's still not the exact same thing. The European archive didn't exactly exist in India. The Mahfuz Khana was slightly a different idea, and so the impression that came out of it was, well, they don't have a history. So Africa, it's very common if you read 19th century narratives of Africa, is they don't have a history. There is no African history beyond European colonialism, because the European conquest of Africa established the European-style state in Africa, and all these documentation started appearing. But the problem doesn't lie with Africa, or the problem doesn't lie with India as such. The problem lies with you, because you're stupid enough to apply a distinctly European idea to a non-European setting, and then believe and claim that, well, you should have it. Why don't you have it? And so what we realize is that this idea of scientific history writing lands you in deep trouble. But that is how Europe tried to know the rest of the world. So the West is trying to know the rest. I love this dichotomy, the West and the rest. The West is trying to know the rest through the lens that is deeply flawed. And the West doesn't know itself, so it doesn't know that it itself is the problem. It's not exactly the rest. But the rest reciprocates, because the knower and the known are both transformed in the process of knowing, and the stories of the reciprocation you will find in reception studies and reception history of European governmentality, which I will not go into specifically at this point. I will when I do the text itself to a later point when I discuss the colonial bourgeoisie, etc. But the application, what we now need to know is that the application of Western models of knowing and Western models of knowledge creation to non-Western societies is problematic, for the reasons why I discussed this. And this leads to also the notion of colonizing mythologies, for example, colonizing histories and demoting them to the standard of mythology. There's a very famous book by the scholar I forgot. It's called Decolonizing Mythology. So a lot of history has actually been demoted to the standard of mythology, because it did not correspond to what the European, the enlightened, brilliant European thought to be scientific history. And so it was just demoted to the standard of mythology. But that's not fair because they have a different standard for judging what is scientific and what is not. I know the natural scientists here, if anybody's listening, would be completely mad at me, but I stand by my word. The same happened with India because, for example, several traditions such as Ayurveda or acupuncture in China became demoted to the level of tradition from a science. Well, science means scientia, means just knowledge, any kind of knowledge, including priestcraft, but that was not deemed worthy knowledge. And you have all these ideas from there. But what it does is it creates hegemony. And that's the second concept that we need to know, is it creates hegemony, which is a concept by Antonio Gramsci. And I'm using hegemony in the Gramscian sense. I'm not using hegemony in several other senses that exist. Over a certain society by a certain population, because it convinces it that this is the actual way of doing stuff, and what you've been doing so long is very wrong, and this is the actual way of doing stuff, and you people don't have a history. Well, yeah, I had a history. No, you don't have a history because your history is not scientific. What you're telling me is not scientific because this is scientific. So this colonization of models of knowing establishes hegemony. What is hegemony? Hegemony is, well, in the Gramscian sense, a tacit manipulation whereby the ruling class or the ruling elite manipulate the ruled into getting their consent. So the ruled willingly subjugate themselves to the ruler. And this is achieved through ideology. This is achieved through writing of history, essentially, because when you write history, you also define identity. And if you read Spivak in the first paragraph or so, yes, in the first paragraph, and she says, although the history of Europe as subject is narrativized by the law, political economy, and ideology of the West. Now, what does she mean by narrativized? There's actually a trick here. When we write history, we have to order not only our arguments, but we have to order whatever we are going to say and our entire story in terms of Aristotle's idea of coherence. If you're a literature student, you already know what I mean. Aristotelian coherence is that a story has to be coherent. It's beginning, middle, and end, and important things should be highlighted more than less important things, and there should be a single storyline. But history is not like that. There is no single storyline in history. History is a cacophony of voices, is an absolute chaos. And there is absolutely no way, and when in the course of subaltern studies, when Ranajit Guha writes the small voice of history, which I think is kind of like a manifesto to the whole subaltern studies and subaltern idea, when Ranajit Guha writes it, which is also a very nice read, I really suggest reading it. He writes towards the last bits of his essay, I think the second last paragraph, that the small voice of history, that is the marginalized or the outcast voice of history, can never be incorporated in traditional history writing because it's not orderly. History is not orderly. There are multiple contradictions. There are multiple interests, issues that raise themselves simultaneously. You can never reduce it down to a nice, beautiful, organized paragraph because you have to order stuff. So important stuff go there, less important stuff go somewhere else. But who decides what is important and what is less important? And if you do that, you're again establishing hegemony. So it is the ideology of the ruling class or the state that defines what is important and thereby writes the history. And you have orthodox history where certain interests and certain ideas and certain notions get primacy over certain other ideas and certain other notions, and history is narrativized. Your identity is narrativized, your society is narrativized in those terms, and then you define your identity in terms of that ideology because your history establishing your identity has been narrativized in that form. Western history is narrativized through, as Spivak says, through the institutions of law, political economy, and the ideology of the West. So the entire argument in Western history, or the core element in Western history, is a very teleological one, actually, is how these institutions of law, political economy, etc. come about. But this statement also means, in the previous sense, how I explained it, is that European historiography, so how Europe writes history of the rest of the world, also looks for these elements in the rest of the world, and thereby lands in trouble well, not for themselves, but mostly for the rest of the world, because they just say, oh, you people do not have them, so you are the problem people. I hope that is clear. I mean, I know this is a bit complicated, but I promise to actually read through the first two paragraphs and explain where all these concepts fit in. So there we have hegemony. And the other key concept that I think is important even before we begin any kind of study of Spivak is the philosophical notion of equivocation. Equivocation, E-Q-U-I-V-O-C-A-T-I-O-N, is a core error in philosophy, or logic actually, where a word is used in multiple senses. So if I use the word, okay, I'll give an example later. So if I deliberately murky the difference between a certain word and use it in multiple senses at the same time, then what I'm actually doing is I'm equivocating, and I can derive a false conclusion from a true premise. I'll explain. A very classic example, actually. If I have premise number 1, so point number 1, the bat is an animal. The bat is a mammal. It's not technically a bird, so it's a mammal. The bat is an animal, so I'm using the word bat in the sense of the winged creature. And I have premise number 2, the bat is used to throw a ball. So the bat in the sense of a cricket bat or a baseball bat, whichever part of the world you are from. So I have premise number 1, the bat is an animal, and the premise number 2, the bat is used to throw a ball. Both premises are correct, and if you go by logic, if you go by the foundations of how logic works, if you have true premises, you cannot have a false conclusion. So if I can equivocate these, although the word bat is used in two different contexts here, and two different meanings, I can equivocate to conclude that an animal is used to throw a ball. That's a completely different type of game. Because, well, a bat is an animal, and a bat is used to throw a ball, so an animal is used to throw a ball. But that's a false conclusion, because I so far don't know of any game where an animal is actually used to throw a ball, or even a bat, for that matter, is used to throw a ball. And so that's equivocating. Now, Spivak deliberately equivocates a number of times, and that's why sometimes reading Spivak is difficult. That's one of the reasons why reading Spivak is difficult, because Spivak deliberately equivocates to expose equivocators. So Spivak deliberately equivocates so that you become aware and you become conscious of equivocation, of people using the two different words which have the same form in two different contexts, but use them to draw a false conclusion. The discussion about Foucault and Deleuze, which is the third episode in my series, How I've Planned It, I will devote an entire episode to that. Why she includes that whole thing there is to argue and to claim that they are actually equivocating. Basically, she calls bluff on all the philosophers in this essay. Basically, she says they're just equivocating and they're generalizing and they're just putting labels on certain things that do not have or do not deserve that label. And equivocation happens a couple of other times in the text, the two most prominent cases being of subject and subjectivity, which is the first paragraph, and in the second case of representation and representation. Spivak mercifully puts a hyphen between representation in the second sense, Darstellen in German, and she also mentions the German words Vertreten and Darstellen, which makes it much easier to read, otherwise it would be absolutely impossible to make any difference between the two. So far we have covered the basic idea of knowledge and the basic epistemology and the basic problem of historiography and history writing that is necessary, and colonial historiography leading up to hegemony, and I've discussed equivocation as a prelude. Now I'll just read the first paragraph and we'll see how these concepts fall into place. Some of the most radical criticism coming out of the West today is the result of an interested desire to conserve the subject of the West, or the West as subject. The theory of pluralized subject effects gives an illusion of undermining subjective sovereignty, while often providing a cover for this subject of knowledge. Although the history of Europe as subject is narrativized by the law, political economy, and ideology of the West, this concealed subject pretends it has no geopolitical determinations. The much publicized critique of the sovereign subject thus actually inaugurates a subject. I will argue for this conclusion by considering a text by two great practitioners of this critique, Intellectuals and Power, a conversation between Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze. My French pronunciation is horrible because my French is non-existent, so please forgive me if there's anybody who learns French or something. So here she introduces actually all of the concepts that I discussed so far. Some of the most radical criticism in the 80s, that is, coming out of the West. I think in the 1999 version, she actually includes the words "some of the most radical criticism in the 80s" that came out of the West, because the 80s is the kind of the peak of post-colonial, post-modernism and post-structuralism in that sense, and so people were actually beginning to challenge this hegemony of European modes of knowing and European epistemic methods that were applied to the rest of the world, and that basically led to a backlash from Europe and deliberate attempts, very frenzied attempts to prove that no, our methods of knowing are actually good enough for the rest of the world. Some of the most radical criticism coming out of the West today is a result of an interested desire to conserve the subject of the West, so or the West as subject. So to conserve the ability, desire, and the power of the West to be able to claim the position of the Arbeiter, or to be able to claim the position, the high ground of being the people who will be knowing the rest of the world. The theory of pluralized subject effects gives an illusion of undermining subjective sovereignty, while often providing a cover for this subject of knowledge. That actually basically means that when the rest is at this point trying to know the West, the subject sovereignty or the subject has become pluralized. So the rest is trying to know the West, and the West is still trying to know the rest, hopefully, and each is being transformed in that attempt. This gives an illusion of undermining subject sovereignty, because, well, if A reduces B to an object and B reduces A to an object, then who is the subject anymore? That's questionable and very difficult to establish. Often providing a cover for the subject of knowledge. Although the history of Europe as subjects is narrativized by the law, political economy, and ideology of the West, this concealed subject pretends it has no geopolitical determinations. So here we have the notion of colonial or Enlightenment epistemology or Enlightenment historiography, because Europe has narrativized or ideologically established the narrative or the logic of Western history and also the history of the rest of the world in terms of these institutions, and has pretended that it has no geopolitical determinations. It has pretended that there's nothing called Eurocentrism, because because Europe doesn't acknowledge Eurocentrism, because the knower does not know itself. The knower does not have a consciousness of itself. So there's no way for Europe to know that our methods are very limited. So there's no way of Europe to realize that Europe is just a small province, because the subject doesn't know itself. That is what she means by this undermines and this pretends that there are no geopolitical determinations. But in the process of writing the history of the rest of the world in terms of the history of Europe, in the same platform or the same paradigm of the history of Europe, they have already established these geopolitical determinations. The much publicized critique of the sovereign subject thus actually inaugurates a subject. So when the subject and the object are both trying to know each other, they are both subjects and objects at the same time. So they are simultaneously the subject and the simultaneously object, because they are simultaneously transforming each other and thereby perpetuating and continuing the process of knowing the other. So A and B are in a relationship where they try to understand what they are doing, and when they are both, so they're at any given point, and this becomes more clear in the second paragraph, at any given point A and B are both subjects and objects. but they're still subjects, so it still inaugurates the subject. The much publicized critique of the sovereign subject actually inaugurates the subject. I will argue for this conclusion by considering a text by two great practitioners. Yeah, so that's the discussion for another day. And she also goes on to say that I've chosen this friendly exchange between two activist philosophers of history because it undoes the opposition between authoritative theoretical production and the unguarded practice of conversation. So when we converse, we don't actually use words very carefully, but when philosophers or when authoritative theoretical producers converse, they are held to a higher standard, funnily enough. So they are supposed to use and choose their words very carefully. I don't know if they do that, but Spivak, what she does is that she uses two philosophers conversing, and she shows that they don't actually choose their words very carefully, because we will see with the example of the French Maoist and stuff. I will discuss the entire issue of Foucault and Deleuze's arguments, including the argument itself, in a separate paragraph, in a separate episode of this series. So for now, I'll just conclude with a small discussion on subjectivity, which I will pick up the next episode. So subjectivity is, or subject is, as explained in the epistemological sense, a very problematic sense, because in epistemology, subject means the agent which has agency over the knowledge production process. So you will automatically realize the subject also establishes or exerts a hegemony on the rest of the population, on what is being known, because the subject, basically the subject asks the question, and what answers you get are defined by what questions you ask. So the subject has sovereignty, that's subject sovereignty in that sense. But subjectivity in the European tradition actually goes back a long way. It goes back to some way to Descartes and to Kant, where they discuss subjectivity. So it has much to do with the idea that the being or the self is composed of two different entities: the material part and the soul, or the knowing, knowledgeable, the knowing sentient part. And subjectivity is mostly to do with which one is the actual self, which is the self-sustaining self. And because if the material is the actual self, then a dead person is still a person, because although they don't have a soul anymore, it's still dead. It's still there. So that's the objective understanding, the mechanistic or the mechanical understanding of the human. And the subjectivity is where you take the soul into consideration. So the subject in this case is a unified whole of the body. And that's generally the idea of subjectivity. There's also Marxist subjectivity, which I will start with in the next session, and that's much more relevant in this case, in this discussion. So I hope that was it for today. I hope that would clear up some of the issues. So I think what you can take from this episode is Rankean philosophy and Rankean thought, basically. I don't really call it philosophy, but that's my opinion. And the ideas of epistemology. I hope I could demonstrate why I said it's important to realize that the knower and the known are always different, and that knowledge is always owned, because the subject owns knowledge. The subject owns agency to own knowledge, and therefore ask the questions. And what answers you get are defined by the questions that you have. And there is no knowledge that exists in isolation. So it doesn't matter whether Africa has a history or not. What matters is whether African history is known and how African history is investigated. So, and the knower and known are always different. So the West doesn't understand actually that they are being stupid in trying to look for elements of their significance, or elements that they know to be the point of history in other societies. And then I moved on to Rankean historiography and its application to the rest of the world, and how it problematizes the process of history writing. And so we will arrive at this idea in Spivak as well, that this kind of history writing essentially subalternizes a population. Although in Spivak and in the general idea of subaltern, which I will also discuss in the next episode. What does it mean to be subaltern? Because oppressed is not equal to subaltern. All subalterns are oppressed, but all oppressed are not subaltern. If you can say that, I've actually heard this say, we are a subaltern group of people. Well, if you can say you're subaltern, you're not subaltern. That's it. So the short answer to the question, can the subaltern speak, is no. Because the moment the subaltern speaks, he or she or it ceases to be a subaltern. That was it for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or if you have any points of discussion, please tell me. You can write in the comment box below, or you can just text me on Facebook, because I expect most of the people who will be listening to this to be my personal acquaintances. And I will be happy to discuss them either with you on chat box or in the next episodes that I will be holding. I think I can upload the next episode next week. I'm sorry for the delay today. Because of the storm, I couldn't connect to the internet. Or at least my parents were paranoid about that. So I am sorry for the delay there. I hope you enjoy it, or if not, at least it's enough food for thought in the lockdown period to be thinking about it. And as you can already see, we can't actually do the text in very fast, and we only managed to basically understand one paragraph, and I think that's generally going to be the speed. But then I will not be discussing the whole text at all. So yeah, that is all for today, and bye.